Hey, teacher, what does the cap say?
It's a Davidson hat.
Huh? Good man.
Yeah, I find it difficult to stare at myself on these Zoom calls all the time. So I wear various things to hide my morning head and so on. So yeah. How's this work? Does John introduce me or do I? Okay. Thank you. I want to start when I'm supposed to.
Good morning, Covenant class. Sorry, I was talking to the Jubilee class there for a minute. Oh, hold on. There we go. So.
Thank you.
See. Y'all are a very quiet bunch today.
Oh, Cecil. I liked your wildcat with the mask on. Oh, he didn't hear me.
Morning, John.
Hey, well, is that John Kirkendall or John Ryan or both of us?
All of the above.
There you go. I didn't want to steal John Kirkendall's good morning. So, well, it is 9:45. Good morning, everybody. I trust that you all know that Tony's memorial service will be live streamed next Saturday, the 17th at 2 p.m. From the sanctuary. You can go to the church's YouTube channel and find that. John Kirkendall is doing the homily for that. And Peter and Robert and I will also be a part of that service. And I did hear that Jacqueline Bussey is coming in, will be a part of the service too. So I know the Abbotts were very pleased for that. Anybody have anything to say before we start this morning? We do have Steve, I'm pointing up because Steve Justus is up in my corner of my screen today. We do have Steve Justus with us today. Steve is a retired doctor who practiced here in the United States and in Tanzania. He is married to Phyllis, who's just coming on my screen. Do you have one or two children? I know you have a son. Do you have you have four. Okay, I just knew the one. Okay, 4 children. And I'll let you take it from there.
Thank you, John. It's good to see everybody. I know most of you. For those who don't know me, Phil and I have lived in Davidson since 2000, in the Charlotte area since '85. Phil went to Wake, I went to Davidson. We do have 4 kids. 2 of them went to Davidson, and they were both economics majors. And I was a little nervous today about what I'm going to be talking about, because I knew I'd be on this with some professors in economics and so on. And I see Dennis down there doing his clapping. So he's probably the one that makes me the most nervous in what I have to talk to you about today. And hopefully he'll pipe in and help me out a little bit. I'm self-proclaiming my authority in what we're talking about. I don't really have any, but when Tony asked me to do the covenant class, I thought it was only 1. I got a little bit surprised that it's actually 4. And what I have in mind today is just a discussion about what I mean by global health equity. When I say that, what does it mean? And it's mostly, what do I mean by it? Although there's probably some common understanding and some degree of agreement around that from the experts, but I want to be able to say what I think it means, and so that I want to bring that lens to what we talk about in the next 3 sessions. My plan is and I think part of the reason I got asked to do this is because I've spent some time in Tanzania in global health. And so that's often of great interest to people. And so next week I want to talk about maternal mortality with a focus on Tanzania. The 3rd week, some form of health system comparisons between Tanzania, the United States, and maybe a Scandinavian country, of just for compare and contrast purposes. And then the last session I want to make about all things COVID, but from a health equity perspective, because I think that's timely and appropriate to do. I'm hoping that this is highly participatory, because what I've prepared is 20 minutes of stuff, and hopefully there's 20 minutes worth of talking, and we get the time filled. If y'all don't say much, we're going to end early, as I guess is the way that it's going to work. I'm going to share my screen and run through a few things that I hope inform today's discussion, but I'm going to also pause because I haven't done the next 3 lessons, and if there are any requests from the audience for any adjustments in the plans for the next 3 times, or any additions to what it is I have planned, or anything you'd like for me to cover, then feel free to pipe in. Otherwise, I'll get started with sharing my screen. Is there anybody who wants to jump in at this point? Okay, well, just wave at me when that's the case. Okay, so I talked with Charlie Renal the other day, and I said, look, Charlie, I mean, I got this series of classes on health equity, and it's a Sunday school class. I mean, what's the deal there? How am I going to relate this back to scripture, or, make this less of a health policy class and more of a Sunday school class? And Charlie suggested that I consider connecting Matthew 22:39 about loving our neighbors as ourselves, which is a great suggestion. Charlie, I also asked Google for an answer and some help on this, and Google suggested Proverbs, this verse from Proverbs that it says that men, but I'm thinking I'm looking at the class roster here, and there's plenty of women. So I think it's both, that may know wisdom and instruction and understand the words of insight and receive instruction in wise dealing, righteousness, justice, and equity. Now, I knew there was plenty of righteousness and justice in the Bible. I wasn't as sure that equity got a mention, but Google helped me out here with this verse. And I do think there's some important distinctions between these things that I wanted to go into a little bit of depth today on, so that when we bring a lens of equity to our health discussions in ensuing weeks, that we're all talking the same language. I wanted to start with an article from the Journal of the American Medical Association, and I just want to throw this headline up and it talks about what has happened with life expectancy in the United States. And the 3 years that it's been decreasing in this study were 2014, 15, and 16. And some of you may have seen this, some not, but I wanted to open up and see if there's any just immediate reaction from the class when they see this headline. Is there anything that immediately comes to mind in a way that you react to seeing that in the United States, life expectancy is out of line with our wealthy counterparts in the world and is actually decreasing?
Steve, is that across the board, or does economic status have a indicator of life expectancy in the U.S.?
Yeah, that question is one of the things that the article explores. In later slides, we will dive into the answer to that a little bit, Glenette. And yes, it does. Any other sort of reactions or questions or that come to mind? Is this surprising or not?
I was very surprised. I was very surprised by that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it defies the way that we think about ourselves, that we're constantly improving, that we have the best healthcare in the world, that, our own impressions of ourselves. Any other reactions?
I think it's surprising because we've had such a huge decline over the generations, and we just kind of expect it's always going to continue, but clearly something is going on.
Yeah. And I think that it's important to try to delve into why here, and to say, okay, something is going on. What is that something? And try to tease it out and understand it. And not that we're going to get all that done in 45 minutes today, but we are going to explore the article in a little more depth. But what I wanted to move to was more of a discussion of what I mean when I say equity. So the Proverbs verse mentioned righteousness and justice, and I'm fortunate, some would say, in my last name, and y'all would recognize, I think, Lady Justus here. And I think this image helps in creating a distinction between justice and equity. So the fact that we have equal rights under the law, which we must assure are impartially balanced. And I see Jesse in this class, and He's probably better situated to speak to issues under the law related to justice than I am, despite my name. But I think that it's important that equality is in the mix here, that rights are in the mix here, that impartiality, essentially with the blindfold, is in the mix here for justice. And you could ask, does it apply to health? Why are you moving to equity? Why aren't we talking about injustice and justice? And the thing is that there is global debate and a movement towards establishing health as a human right. WHO is in the lead on that. There's discussion about universal healthcare access. It's a global health issue, challenge that they're laying out there for the rest of the world to consider human health as a human right. And when that happens, then health is more adjudicated under systems of justice when it comes to the equality of one's rights than it is if it's not considered a human right. And I think the debate is ongoing. And certainly when I'm coming from an American culture of individualism and I'm participating in global health, my skepticism about human health as a human right is in the mix here, and not one that I sort of raised my hand eagerly in those audiences to suggest, hey, look at me, the American doctor who's not quite sure human health is a human right. But because that's not well established, I think the better lens for viewing our discussion is equity, and the difference there is important. I think equity is sometimes understood to be distributive justice, and I think because the word justice is used in the understanding of what equity is, it contributes to some of the confusion. But I think what's important is that equity comes into play when something needs to be fairly distributed, and this is where Dennis rather than Jesse jumps in here, I think, because often that something is of value. Not necessarily always. I mean, some of us, if not most of us, have been parents, and probably one of the more common refrains that we've heard as parents is, that's not fair, that's not fair. And often that had less to do with distributing things of value than it did distributing some discipline across those 4 kids I had. And the choruses of that's not fair, I think we've all heard before. And if children can say that with some degree of certainty in their stance, I think that there's probably something innate about our understanding of what's fair. There's something that when we see something, now we may not be legal experts and always understand what is just, but I think that we have sort of more of a innate sense of fairness. And this may not be a fair distinction to make, but I think that just is more, there's more like a science to it. There's laws, and fairness is more of an art in terms of how you might discern it. I think you need to take the blindfold off when you're dealing with fairness. Fairness is not always about these two scales being equal. It's not necessarily fair that things get distributed equally when they're distributed fairly. And so I think that healthcare viewed through the lens of equity is a more approachable way to understand health and the issues around what are some of the causal factors in that JAMA article, what are some of the issues we face in health and healthcare today. And I think equity is an appropriate lens, and that's why I'm suggesting we use it over the next 3 sessions. Now, so health and equity. So moving from the equity side of that to the health side, you're probably aware of, and these are not necessarily, there's some variation in what people think the determinants of health are, but here are 5 examples. And why I think this is important is because it shows why I think that I struggle with the understanding of health as a human right because of its multi-determinate nature. Something being someone's right when they can individually destroy it, I have an issue with. But that's a whole different rabbit hole that we could debate at some other time about whether human health is a human right. But I think it's important to have some understanding of the determinants of health as we go through a discussion or looking at things from the lens of equity. So I think these are fairly self-explanatory, but just as a means of explaining them, just examples. Policymaking, so Affordable Care Act, banning smoking in bars and restaurants, mandatory vaccinations. These kinds of policies affect the health of a population. And these determinants of health, just as an aside, can apply to an entire population. It can apply to an individual. By and large, I'm going to be talking about populations as opposed to the health of an individual. Although all these determinants apply to both, I'm going to be speaking of health in the aggregate in terms of the health of a population. Social factors, so that it's the availability of resources to meet your daily needs. So in healthcare reform, social determinants of health are coming to the forefront, and it's things like food insecurity, transportation insecurity, housing insecurity, but it's not just that. It is also the social norms and attitudes, discrimination and racial justice. Why do blacks have, why are they treated differently in the hospital than white folks? I mean, that is more perhaps a function of discrimination and social attitudes than, so that's included in social factors. Now, health services, I think we have an understanding of what I mean by that in terms of medical care delivery. Individual behavior, again, self-explanatory, smoking, eating, exercising, sleeping, biology and genetics, I think we know. What I don't know, I don't think that we probably as a group have a common understanding of is, what do you think the relative contribution of each of these determinants are to the actual health of a population? If you were going to say what percentage of health is attributable to individual behavior versus, social determinants, I wanted to point out a few because I think they might be surprising. And I wanted y'all to guess a little bit. So let's start with health services. Can anybody throw out a guess as to what percentage they think the delivery of medical care contributes to a population's health? Any guesses?
20%.
20?
Yeah.
40,
40?
40%.
Okay. And these are not, I mean, these are, I'm going to say in ranges, because the studies that you see mentioned down there on this slide differ and vary and, sometimes in significant ways. But by and large, the studies had this as a 10 to 20% contribution, which I think would surprise Americans, because I think we default to this area for an understanding of why our health outcomes are what they are. And part of healthcare reform is addressing that longstanding bias towards viewing our health outcomes as primarily being determined by the medical services that we receive. And I think it does make some sense that we've made a mistake there and need to adjust our thinking. Now, under the sort of social factors, any guesses for a range or a number for social determinants of health?
Being an economist, I would say that the economic factors and income levels probably are about 75%. You look at third world countries that they used to call them, their life expectancy is 65 to 70 years old, and ours is 80, the high income countries. So I think income is a huge factor.
Yeah, and discrimination, discrimination against people of color. So I think the social factors are really huge.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I was seeing numbers in the range of 40 in the literature, but I think, you know, again, it's maybe bigger than than some people might have otherwise thought before. And I think it's justified that in our country's healthcare reform that we're turning our attention to this area. I think it's difficult and complicated to tackle, but important to address and understand more thoroughly. These are not mutually exclusive categories. Sometimes one drifts into the other. The last one I wanted to just bring up was the individual behavior one, because I think that's something that Americans particularly gravitate towards, particularly if we're going to start having discussions around what's fair when it comes to healthcare and one's own individual liberties and individual responsibilities. As Americans weigh into this significantly. So our own understanding of the contribution of individual behavior to healthcare is important. What would be the guess of the range there?
Isn't that totally entwined with the social factors? It's hard to tease that out in my head.
Yeah, Rosemary, that got to my earlier point, how these aren't mutually exclusive, that, you know, one person's sort of alcohol abuse is, you know, is that an individual choice or some function of, you know, socioeconomic distress, or, you know, there's not a way necessarily to tease them out cleanly.
And there's social norms that, I don't know, and food deserts and things like that, that totally influence individual behavior.
Yeah.
So it's just hard to separate that out about how much individual behavior implies to me that it's stuff you have a choice about. And a lot of those behaviors people don't have a choice about.
Yeah. Yeah. By the same token, I guess, you know, the fact, if at the very building block nature of what you eat, how active you are, and how much you rest are significant contributors. You know, if you were to sort of say, okay, no matter what socioeconomic class you are, if you're compared to other similar socioeconomic classes, if you eat better, exercise more, and rest appropriately, then you're going to be healthier than your neighbor who's in your same, you know, socioeconomic situation. But and so this, you know, this is fairly significant, at least according to some of these articles down here, somewhere in the 30 to 50% range. None of these are perfect. I just wanted particularly to bring up the fact that health services, which is the focus of a lot of our thinking around our policy making and that sort of thing, is really a fairly low contributor to health outcomes, in the 10 to 20% range, I think. And not surprising to everyone on this and on this Zoom, but it's a little surprising to me even. I wanted to go back a little bit, as Glenette brought up when some of her reaction to this article, just to dive into the meat of it a little bit, not too much, but just a little bit, just so you can understand more than just the headline version of what this said. So to Glenette's point, this is not everybody who's having an increase in their mortality rates. This is really focused on midlife deaths, and that mortality for that age group was going up. And the reason that from birth to death, life expectancy has decreased is because this particular group has decreased significantly, even while some of the other groups, infant survival and older age groups, have had ongoing improvements in their age groups' mortality rates. The midlife group has particularly suffered, and from a timing perspective, that suffering and diminishment began in the 1980s and 90s, increasing all along, and finally overtook some of the improvements that were happening over that same time period. We were still doing better with cancer survival and heart attack survival and some other things. And so we were having this improvement, maybe not as dramatic as we were having it in the 70s, but for all comers, the causes of mortality for this midlife age group started catching up to the point that the entire life expectancy in the last 3 years has gone down. And this is some very disappointing, as you probably well know, that we spend vastly more than other countries, and that this particular health metric is not the only one where we underperform. You know, maternal mortality, infant mortality, many other health metrics, the United States is not performing as well as it should. I sort of chose this one just to sort of highlight some of the discussions that we might have around equity related issues, because I think that equity plays a role in the explanation for why this is happening. So these are the actual numbers of what's taken place, that it increased from around 70 to 79 over the course of those decades, but it's decreased a little bit in the last 3 years. Our rate of increase was slowing, but now it actually started trending down. And so, there are certain sort of cause-specific mortality rates that highlight where the problem lies. And that is drug overdoses, suicides, and some of the organ system diseases of hypertension and diabetes that in this midlife age group have been increasing to the point that it's affected the overall population's average life expectancy.
Steve, that also is indicated by the cost that Medicare has to pay for various diseases. Many of them are individual behavior related: smoking, diet, lack of exercise. And I think Medicare's total expenditures is something like, I can't remember exactly, but maybe 2/3 of what they spend are on 3 or 4 specific diseases that are somewhat related to individual behavior.
Yeah, and smoking's an interesting one just because there's a lag off, the fact that people are smoking less now, the effects of people smoking a lot decades earlier is manifesting itself now, just because some of the disease processes have a lag time from when you smoked heavily and you end up with ischemic heart disease or cancer at a later age. So
I was going to say too, if you spend time in the rural areas, this is not surprising that just if you're observant in many of those rural areas where we spend a good bit of time, have lots of relatives, you see that there are lots of issues with not only the drugs, but with the obesity, diabetes at such young ages, and continued smoking, as well as no exercise.
Yeah. And so this slide is a bit of a summary slide, and this is part of the reason I was nervous with Dennis on the call, because he maybe can speak to this, I think, to his earlier point around his high level of attribution of population health to socioeconomic factors. There is a lot of line of evidence that connect this life expectancy trending to socioeconomics. There's a linkage. The linkage is timing related, because it started trending downward and poorly in the 80s and 90s, which was a time period where there was undergoing major economic transformation, loss of American manufacturing, wage stagnation, increasing income inequality it began decades ago. It's not a problem just springing up now. So the timing of when the trend began correlates with that timing of socioeconomic transformation in a negative way.
Excuse me, Steve, the spreading inequality actually started about 1976 and 77. It's been a long-term trend in that period, since that period.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt.
And no, that's fine. It's just that what they were observing was trending along with it, but it basically slowed our life expectancy progress is what it did early. And it's only in the last few years that it's actually decreased it. And because the burden of that has increased over time. And the other thing that is, I think, to Angie's point, is that the populations that are affected are those that are most vulnerable to this new economy. So the rural populations, non-college educated people, they're the ones that, if you were to stratify them, they're the ones who are bearing the brunt of all-cause mortality in midlife more than other parts of our population. And lastly, also a little to Angie's point, is where this is happening. Across our United States, this trend is not uniform. There are parts of our countries that are performing much worse than others. The areas of our country struggling the most are in New England and the Ohio Valley. And I don't think our electoral map in our 2016 election probably overlays pretty well with this problem set, not to get political too quickly. But I think it is there's some relationship there.
Yeah, just a thought, and this hit when I see suicides, and this hit on Friday. I was on the email and I got a note that, and I had coached baseball in high school for about 11 years. Over a 20-year period, I probably dealt with about, probably 400, maybe 300 players. 3 of them had committed suicide within that 20-year period. Started at age 18, the last one age 35. And they're all from white backgrounds, relatively affluent. And I think this is a trend that's only going to continue to get worse, especially with what we're dealing with COVID right now.
Yeah, good point. In the third Sunday, maybe hope to get into this a little bit more around this particular point that was made in the JAMA article, and that is that social protective services merit special attention. Countries with higher life expectancy spend more on social services and also outperform the US in education, child poverty, and other measures of well-being. And that, I think, we should note and take into account when we are trying to come up with solutions. Our solutions have, as a position, have largely been about improving medical care services, and we need to be more holistic when it comes to this, because I don't think that the quality of healthcare services is necessarily related to what we're seeing with this decreasing life expectancy. Within the health service category, I would say that access to health services is probably a problem. So if you're thinking about a health system, you have the quality of care, you have the ability to pay for it, and you have access to it, as all sorts of parts of the system that contribute to how well that system performs. And the fact that our cancer survival rate's better, our scientists are formidable, our quality is probably sufficient relatively compared to other high income countries. I don't think that we pay for it well, given that we pay so much, and our sustainability is subject to poor comparison, and also our access is just terrible related to other countries who have much better performance in their population health than we do. So I wanted to come back to this again and mainly ask questions in these areas, because I think you can tease out equity related questions around each of these buckets of determinants of health in terms of, and I think an equity question begins with, is it fair that? And you ask an equity question with that sort of lead in. So, on policy, is it fair that states vary in their policies around issues that affect health? Because in this particular study, it references that state policies on minimum wage and earned income tax credit, they predicted non-drug suicide trends, that 5 states that had stable or reduced firearm suicides during a 20-year period that ran counter to the national trend were those with stricter gun control laws. Is it fair that, that people in the Ohio Valley are subject to their state's policies relative to the New York and California residents? That's a fairness question. Is it fair that North Carolina has not expanded Medicaid? Is that fair? Is it fair that Black Americans have poor healthcare outcomes? In the individual area, fairness can turn on its head a little bit. Is it fair for insurers to check our urine for nicotine and charge us higher premiums? Is that fair? And so I think equity questions when it comes to health is an important lens to take, because I think it lends itself towards coming up with solutions to the challenges that we face as a people, and that more equitable solutions are part of the answer to the problems that we face now. I don't know about whether anybody has a reaction to that. That might mean that I'd rather be Dr. Equity than Dr. Justice, I think. I always did walk into the ER room and say, "This is Dr. Justice," and sometimes people would just laugh. I mean, like, it was a weird thing to introduce myself sometimes, because I was an ER doctor and people didn't know me and they didn't know the name of the doctor they were going to see, and I'd walk in and say who I was. And some people even joked I needed like a superhero uniform instead of my white jacket and that sort of thing. So I've always I like my name, but after doing this, I think Dr. Equity would be okay too. And yeah,
It's Missy.
Missy.
Before you get off North Carolina and the fact that we don't have Medicare.
Okay,
What?
Medicaid.
Can you give us any facts of comparison to states or areas of equal size and the disadvantage we're in? I've never heard any facts and figures, just that we don't have it. And I'd love to be able to make a stronger case.
I think that I can't. I'd have to go and do one of these. I'll get back to you on it, because some of the states that have done particularly poorly in this have ironically provided Medicaid, like Kentucky, for example, Republican state, expanded Medicaid, but is on the list of states that underperform when it comes to life expectancy. What I don't know is whether on the timing of Medicaid expansion, it's happened recently enough to affect the numbers that we're looking at right now from a timing perspective. I don't know the answer to that, Missy. So I don't know how to do you increase or you expand Medicaid in 2015. At what point are you going to see the benefits of that? And somebody's probably answered that question and compared the states that have expanded Medicaid to those that haven't. And I'll need to go and look that up and come back to you.
Steve, one small factor in that comparison you're talking about is the fact that states can apply to the Medicare and Medicaid for waivers, in which allows them to do something differently than other states might. And some of that has to do with the range of benefits that are provided. So sometimes, even though Medicaid may have been expanded, the fact of the matter is that their benefits are much less than other Medicaid advantage states.
Yeah, that's a good point, Cecil. And oh, well, it's 10:26. I think what 10:30 is the closing, but I wanted to maybe close with just the acknowledgement that the equity lens may not be 100% sufficient for our sort of solution development. And I will say that the question of does that seem fair to you? I can see that there are individuals, particularly in the United States, that hold individual responsibility and individual liberty in great esteem. And to answer yes, that it is somehow fair that high quality healthcare is only readily accessible to those with the means to pay for it, they can still say, yeah, that's fair to me. That seems fair to me. But then I'd ask it that, okay, in your view, it may be fair, but is it right? So maybe there is a place for Charlie in this whole mix after all, and Dr. Righteousness might be the best sort of overall answer to healthcare when equity falls short. So maybe at a later date we can have Charlie talk to us about Dr. Righteousness. But I was basically sticking with equity today, realizing that even that is not always the perfect sort of lens for this, because we also sort of have a sense of, okay, maybe you can say that's fair, but is it right? And I think, we sometimes know it's just not. And there's a lot. I think that to somebody's earlier point, it's not just that there may be unfairness in what we learn from this JAM article and what's going on in our country. There's also something not right here. So I think that's an important thing. It's kind of sad. I hate ending on a sad note on a rainy day. If somebody has something uplifting to say right now, that'd be greatly appreciated. But I appreciate the chance to speak with you, and I hope the next 3 sessions prove interesting to you. I look forward to spending more time with you. Oh, and because this is a Sunday school class and not a health policy class, my wife suggests I end in prayer. So let me do that. Father, we thank you for spending time together. We thank you for the opportunity to learn from each other. Help us understand what righteousness and justice and equity is, and help us apply that in everything that we do and with everyone that we come into contact with. Be with those who are struggling with isolation and illness, and help our country, Lord, to come through this mess. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Can I say something? This is Charlie.
Jay, Charlie.
I am awed by your presentation, and I'm fearful of your expectation that I'm going to be Dr. Righteousness. But here's what I will say. I'm going to be, at Tony's request, talking with you about Dr. Paul, who made it his theme in Galatians to talk about righteousness and what is good and right in the sight of God and in the light of Jesus and in the movement of the Holy Spirit in the human heart. So you threw more at me than I was expecting. You said that happened to you in case of this class. I guess we're in the same boat.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Charlie.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank
Okay,
you,
guys.
Steve.
Thanks,
All right.
Steve. This is great.
Y'all
Thank
have
you,
a good
Steve.
Thank
week.
you, Steve.
Appreciate it.
All right.
Great.
Great
Next
class.
week.